Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And today we are having the first part of a two-part event on U.S. policy toward Asia. The session will be moderated by Jacques deLisle, who's the Asia Program Director at FPRI. And we're going to feature Senior Fellow and Michael H. Armacost, Chair of the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, Ryan Hass. And as I mentioned today, they're going to be talking about U.S. relations with China. Jacques deLisle, whom many of you know, is the Stephen A. Cozen Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. A few little housekeeping notes. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we'll be going to questions about halfway through the program. And if any topics come up that require a map, we'll be putting a map in the chat box as well. And if you have any technical problems, let us know in there and we'll do our best to help you. Finally, I'd like to say thank you to our members and sponsors and tell you how much we appreciate the support you provide us, which enables to bring programs like this to you. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jacques.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to welcome to FPRI's Asia program an old friend and colleague, Ryan Hass, who is, as Raleigh just told you, the Michael H. Armacost Chair in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, where he's also a Senior Fellow. He's also got a joint appointment with the China Center at the John L. Thornton China Center at Brookings and the Center for East Asia Policy Studies. He's also, boy, you got a lot of jobs. He's also the interim Chun Fu and Cecilia Yen Ku Chair in Taiwan Studies, position until recently held by the estimable and venerable Richard Bush, who is just retired from Brookings, but hardly from the biz. And he is also a non-resident affiliated full fellow at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale Law School, a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a senior advisor to both McLarty Associates and the Skokock Group, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But I'm going to put in a plug for one of his lesser hats, which is he is one of the 20 people who are contributing policy papers and advice as part of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S. China Relations, which is also something FPRI is a co-sponsor of. Before he took on all the hats I just described, he was a longtime State Department and national security staff person. He was the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council from 2013 to 2017. I was part of Obama's state visit delegations in Beijing and Washington, as well as the APEC delegation and the trip to Hangzhou. He also served in U.S. embassies in the region for quite some time. He was at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, where he earned the State Department Director General's Award for Impact and Originality in Reporting. He also served in Seoul and Ulaanbaatar. He also worked stateside on the Taiwan Coordination and Korean Affairs Office as the State Department. So a really rich experience in the region, won lots of awards for that sort of thing. And he also writes a lot. So I recommend to you his book, Stronger, Adapting America's China Strategy in the Age of Competitive Interdependence, and many of his commentaries that you can find on the Brookings webpage. Or if you're lazy, you can just troll the usual newspapers to see him quoted on issues of U.S.-China relations and U.S. policy toward the region. So now we're about out of time. I'm going to move over to raise some issues with Ryan here. So we're now a month plus a bit, well, almost a month rather. We're a month plus a bit into when we started hearing announcements in detail about what the president-elect's policy would be, and now we're several weeks into the new presidency, the Biden administration. So what do you make of China policy so far? What are the distinctive aspects of Biden's China policy, and in what way do they mark departures from or continuations of what we've seen in recent years? So small question there. I'll throw it over to you, Ryan.
Well, first of all, Jacques, thank you for hosting me, and thanks to Raleigh as well as FPRI. It's really an honor for me to be with you, and I look forward to our discussion today. On your question, like you said, it's still early days, so I think that we're going to have a little bit of patience before we cast, definitive judgments about the Biden administration's overall approach to China. But even so, I think that we can already begin to see a few, distinct characteristics of the Biden administration's approach to China coming into focus. The first that has struck me is that the Biden administration seems to be embedding China within a series or suite of issues. In other words, China is not the singular issue that is burning and eclipsing all other challenges that the United States confronts on the world stage. Second, related to that, I think that the rhetorical heat on China has been turned down a notch. We haven't been hearing about China viruses or Kung flus or other sort of racially loaded terms in the way that we were earlier this year and in last year. And related to that, there has been a pretty high degree of message discipline. There's been a pretty common thread of communication that has been emanating from the White House, from the State Department, from the Defense Department, and elsewhere. We've seen it throughout the confirmation hearings, as well as from the spokespeople's podiums. I think that the Biden administration has been pretty forthright about describing the relationship as predominantly competitive, but not exclusively so. In other words, I think with President Biden's speech last week and some other comments that we've seen and heard, they have made the point that even though they acknowledge and accept the competitiveness of the relationship, they still have important work that they feel like they need to get done with China. And that's a bit of a discontinuity from the last administration. And, just more broadly, taking a step back, it feels like the Biden administration is sort of settling in for the long haul, a long haul systems competition where there won't be dramatic breakthroughs. We're not going to fix the trade deficit next year. There won't be dramatic calls for changing China's political or economic models. There will not be pursuit of a vision of full-scale decoupling, but rather just sort of, the tough, grinding, long-term work of two incompatible systems competing with each other to see which one will perform better over time. And so that's sort of how I've been looking at the Biden administration's approach over the first couple of weeks. The shifts have been somewhat subtle, but I think they've been significant. And I don't think the Biden administration is going to loudly repudiate their predecessor's approach to China. But if you look in these areas, I think you can find some discontinuities.
So one of the areas where the Biden folks early on signaled some degree of discontinuity was to stress what they saw as areas of possible cooperation with China. I mean, I think it's a fair statement that although we had many moments when Trump would say very kind things about his special relationship with Xi Jinping, perhaps not as special as relationship with Kim, but there were these moments of praise for how Xi handled Hong Kong, COVID, whatever, and then by the end we were into full-scale demonization. But the Biden folks said, okay, yes, right, competitive in many spheres, rivalrous in some areas, oppositional, but look for cooperation where we can. A couple of areas that have received some attention there are climate and public health issues, COVID, things like that. Are those areas where you think there is more hope for cooperation, and are there others you would put on the list?
Well, I am fairly optimistic on this score. I think that the president feels like it is possible to cooperate with competitors, and I think that that's a viewpoint that the rest of his team seem to have embraced. I think that for the Chinese, the view is similar. And so when it's in our interest and in China's interest to work together, I think that we will. And on that list, I would put many of the things that you just described. Climate change, sort of accelerating the decarbonization of the global economy is something that's in both of our interests. On COVID, neither of our citizens are going to be safe until COVID is stamped out in every corner of the world. And the only way that it will do so is if vaccines reach every corner of the world, which is an enormous sort of historic logistical lift in the history of humanity. No country can do it on its own. The World Health Organization lacks the capacity to do it by itself. It's only going to be done if the United States and China, perhaps underneath the umbrella of COVAX or the World Health Organization, really, really put their shoulder into this effort to vaccinate, several billion people. And then related to that, the global economy is going to need to recover, and it's going to be difficult for it to recover unless the two largest economies are sort of rowing in the same direction on that score. So I think that there is a pragmatic menu of issues where it would serve both sides' interests to find some common cause.
And just worth underscoring there that a couple of early moves by the Biden administration that speak to some of that is rejoining the Paris Climate Accords, which Trump had begun the process of getting us out of. So that's a foundation for possible climate cooperation, and of course rejoining the WHO, which Trump had withdrawn from, and joining COVAX, the vaccine thing. So the institutional underpinnings are being put in place there. So one of the sources of criticism or concern as the Biden administration came to office, particularly you hear this a lot in Taiwan, you hear this in Hong Kong, but other places too, that there was a concern that we would see a return to what some saw as a too soft policy on China, right? And so there's is this going to be back to the Obama era approach? And you were involved in that administration, we can have a little side conversation about that. But times have changed, China's behavior has changed. And so, how do you sort of answer that concern that we would see a return to policies which may or may not have been appropriate 4 years ago? I tend to think a lot's changed and that matters. But that these are people who were associated with the pivot and with constructive engagement and with things that are less Trump-like or perhaps more neutrally are a tougher line toward China.
Well, it's a great question, and it's a valid question. Bilahari Kausikan and I had a debate on the op-ed page of Nikkei about this very issue several weeks ago. And Bilahari is, he expressed the anxieties that you just described, and I did my best to try to puncture them because I think they're pretty inflated, probably overinflated. As you said, the United States has changed over the past 4 years. China has changed over the past 4 years. The world has changed over the past 4 years. And more importantly, no one around President Biden is pining for a return to the Obama administration's approach to China. Nobody. And so, I think that some of these concerns are the equivalent of swinging at ghosts. There isn't really a lot of basis for them, but they're real and they're pervasive concerns that we should take seriously. The other thing that I would suggest is that if you think that Obama was too conciliatory and Trump was too confrontational, then you might find some comfort in, sort of the Goldilocks of Joe Biden, because I think he will fall somewhere in between those two poles.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on a question. So people obviously are aware of putting questions in the Q&A function. I encourage you to continue to do that. Let me pick up on one that I think speaks to some of what you said in your earlier remarks, which is about the settling in for the long haul. And I think this is certainly a stylistic contrast that has potentially substantive consequences. That is, instead of looking for the next tweet and looking for the next pendulum swing, which we forget given how things ended, there was a long time during the Trump administration where it seemed to go one extreme or the other. So if you're settling in for the long haul, this kind of competition rather than demonization, our question asks, this seems like a discontinuity, but how will this play out in areas that are not simply U.S. China face-to-face, but in what is now, in a sense, a global relationship and something of a global competition? I mean, one of the many changes from a period when we could say, U.S.-China relations weren't benevolent is that China now has interests in places like Africa and interests in the polar regions, has tried to make some inroads in the eastern fringes of Europe, the CEE countries and things like that. So what does that competition or that engagement look like if we broaden the frame outside the sort of East Asian context where the US and China are kind of in one another's face in an obvious way?
Well, it's a great question. I guess I think about it in two ways. The first is that there really is no path to global leadership that allows for a detour around China. As you were describing, China is present in basically every major consequential global challenge that the United States will confront, either as a problem or as a partner. And ignoring China, if we want to reassert global leadership, just isn't an available option to the United States. So we're going to have to deal with them whether we like them or not. And I think one way to do that effectively is to take a little bit of the venom and emotion out of the process. We're two major global powers who should find ways to deal dispassionately with each other, guided by our respective interests. And there'll be times when we agree and times when we disagree, and that's okay. This doesn't need to be sort of a personalized or emotional issue. But the second thought that I have is that the Trump administration took a very direct approach to dealing with China and the problems that they identified emanating from China. And we've run that experiment now and sort of seen what the results are. the Biden administration appears to be taking a less direct approach of sort of building what Dean Acheson long ago talked about as situations of strength. Finding common cause with allies and partners, friends who share common concerns about, in this case, Chinese behavior, and then figuring out where our interests overlap and where we can work together to push back on problematic Chinese behavior. And this won't yield immediate results. It's not going to create headlines tomorrow, next week, next month, or perhaps next year. But hopefully over time, it will be part of a process of sort of building blocks of strengthening America's relative position to compete with China on these issues, whether it's in Eastern Europe or the polar region, maritime issues, or energy security.
So to pick up on another thread from earlier in the conversation, COVID obviously was a focus of mutual demonization by the U.S. and China. We heard, as you said, the Wuhan virus, the suspicion that it was from a Chinese lab, which Pompeo in particular stoked, and declassifying the information on the way out the door for what it's worth. And the Biden administration talking more cooperation. Well, one of the focal points of the Trump critique was that the WHO was essentially complicit with China and was currying favor. And the WHO's answer was, we need cooperation to deal with this. There's a lot of back and forth about that. And I think there were a total of 3 WHO missions sent to China to try to figure this out. One in the early days, another over the summer, and then finally this one that has produced a report, which among other things debunked the lab theory. So in terms of the Biden administration agenda of getting re-engaged with and supporting international organizations that Trump opted out of, and trying to, I think, even though I certainly take the point that we're not seeing a back to the future moment, we are seeing a notion that one of the ways to deal with China is in the context of international institutions to try to bring the collective accountability or standards that come from that. So do you see the most recent phases of China's engagement with WHO, including this last team? Is that a hopeful sign on that front?
I think it's too early to tell. We're gonna have to wait to see. My hope is that we will begin to focus much more of our attention upon what needs to be done now, looking forward, to save lives and stop the spread of the virus, and then allowing the scientists the time and the space to do the necessary work outside of the glare of the media spotlight to figure out what the origin of this virus was, so that we can fix that problem going forward. And if we look forward, there's a lot that needs to be done immediately. We talked earlier about the distribution of the vaccine. The other issue that needs to be addressed is building a global surveillance network so that we can identify rapidly when these new mutations of the virus pop up around the world and begin to spread. Because the reality is that the vaccines that have been developed are for COVID-19. They're not for the mutations that are developing in Brazil and South Africa, the UK, and elsewhere. And unless and until we're able to build a surveillance network around the world so that we can catch these mutations quickly, we're constantly going to be behind. And the mutations are going to be spreading around the world, and we're just going to find ourselves in a really bad place. And this isn't a U.S. China problem to solve, but the United States and China are the 2 most capable countries in the world when it comes to public health capacity. So hopefully, through both of our presence again underneath the WHO umbrella, we'll be able to find some common cause and ability to contribute each of our own relative strengths to building the surveillance network.
Yeah, we have another question I think speaks to some of the cooperative elements, and I'll loop back to some other topics. But one of the other forms of cooperation that has taken a hit is the exchange of people back and forth, right? Particularly in the STEM fields, Chinese scholars coming here. Obviously, there have been issues of U.S. scholars who took money as part of the China 1,000 Talents program and other things. So that area, which was once one of quite open collaboration, and I think a source of relatively good feeling in the relationship, is now seen, certainly on the U.S. side, has been seen as something of a security threat. Do you see the Biden administration changing course on how to handle that? Clearly, the new president has been quite vocal on the need to take the racist tinge out of this, and that's clearly to be welcome. But do you think we're going to see a significant shift back, given that there are, in some cases, genuine and legitimate national security and national economic security concerns?
Yeah, it's a great question. I honestly don't know the answer to it, but I can make an informed speculative guess based upon having had the opportunity to work alongside many of these people who are in the Biden administration, as well as the president previously. I would be surprised if these issues continue to be framed as a whole of society threat, and creating this sort of this sense of fear and the need for mobilization to counter, yellow people who are coming into the United States and stealing America's future. My guess is that there will continue to be a acute focus on trying to root out the national security concerns that we have about Chinese espionage, which are real and should be dealt with all the tools available to the United States government. But to do so in a more tailored way and sort of less of a broad brush, whole of society versus whole of society type of challenge. And my hope is that over time that will lead to a mellowing out of sort of the intensity around some of these issues and allow for the people-to-people interactions to resume in a healthy manner. Because I think that it serves America's interest to have the benefit of Chinese students in our universities and elsewhere.
So you'd alluded to making educated guesses based on having worked with some of these people. And certainly if you talk to people around Washington where you hang out, or pretty much anywhere inside the Third Ring Road in Beijing or many other places, everybody wants to say who's in, who's out, and what does it mean. So could you tell us a little bit about what you see as the internal dynamics in the Biden administration? I guess there are two pieces to this. One we touched upon a little bit, which is some of your former colleagues in the Obama administration, some of whom also were in the Clinton administration before that, are back. I mean, Kurt Campbell as the Asia czar at the National Security Council. Blinken obviously has his history prior to being Secretary of State in these areas. So there are a bunch of personnel, a bunch of people whom you know well. And there's also the fact that, the deep state may be exaggerated, but there is a state out there. There are different views from the Defense Department, the State Department, and others. So what's your sense of the landscape of the sort of, below the presidential level? How's it working out among the personnel and the institutional interests, and what does it mean for U.S. China relations?
Well, I've been sort of amused to watch the discussion around this question. The Financial Times wrote a piece last week or the week before talking about the young guns versus the old guard. The Wall Street Journal last week talked about a team of rivals on China policy. And it's fascinating to read and entirely inaccurate from my perspective. The reality is that this is a group of people who know each other well, have worked closely with each other, both inside and outside of government, have a lot of respect for each other, and they all understand who they work for. They work for Joe Biden, and President Biden's views will be decisive on many of these questions. Biden is not a blank slate. He's been dealing with China and every Chinese leader for the past 40 years, dating back to Deng Xiaoping. He has his own views, and if anyone walks into the Oval Office and tries to explain to him how China works, I think he'll make clear that he also has his own depth of experience on these issues as well. Furthermore, I think that on the big issues, the team is in pretty broad agreement. In other words, there is broad agreement on the diagnosis of the relationship, that we are in a long-term strategic competition with China. There is broad agreement on the notion that technology issues sort of sit at the core of that competition. There is a recognition that China is going to be a long-term problem to be managed, not a problem with immediate solutions. And there is, I think, a shared value in the idea of returning to a more orderly policy process, where each department and agency sort of plays its role. The Department of Commerce thinks about issues through the prism of how they impact the business community. The State Department weighs options against other diplomatic equities. The Defense Department thinks about things in a security prism. And the intelligence community tries to anticipate how China and other actors would respond to potential options under consideration. But even beyond that, I think that there is a shared acceptance among this team that there are first order priorities to strengthen our ability to compete with China and gain leverage for dealing with China. And that includes, restoring America's domestic cohesion, strengthening our alliances, sort of reviving American prestige on the world stage, and restoring the power of America's example. So if you sort of add all that up, it doesn't make for the sort of exciting headlines that we've seen in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, but I think it's probably a more accurate picture of how these dynamics are playing out inside.
Yes, we've talked about sort of the big pictures, some areas of cooperation, and the personnel. Let's get to the stuff that does make the headlines, which is China's done a bunch of things that have raised concerns in the U.S. that straddle from the past administration to the current one. And we can go through the list, and I guess I will, and throw them to you. So we've seen what's happened in Hong Kong, which is in many ways a story that's been going on for decades now, but the last 2 years have been particularly acute with the Chinese response to the protests that started out focusing on the so-called extradition ordinance that might send Hong Kongers to China for trial. Then we saw the crackdown on the protests, and we saw the national security law for Hong Kong, which potentially leads to jail time for expressions of what we would consider largely dissident views, although they're framed as sedition and subversion and things like that. And we saw the postponement of the Hong Kong elections. That's a concern. Xinjiang, again, it's been a human rights concern for some time, but it's taken a big step up in the last year or two as we've come to know about the level of concentration camps, something approaching cultural genocide. Indeed, the issue of genocide came up, I think, in Blinken's confirmation hearings, as well as forced sterilizations, that sort of thing. And we've got China being much more assertive toward Taiwan. We've seen military operations get much closer, many more crossings of the median line in the strait by Chinese aircraft, circumnavigation by Chinese ships, and some pretty tough rhetoric on the Taiwan issue, which again, been there for decades, but took a qualitative turn when the Taiwanese voters had the temerity to elect Tsai Ing-wen from the Democratic Progressive Party rather than sticking with the Kuomintang. But it's gotten, I think, fair to say, worse again in the last several months. So what's the impact of those kinds of developments on the Biden administration's options and the Biden administration's choices for engaging in China, which, if you look at that list, is more assertive and is, shall we say, on the opposite side of the values issues from the values that the Biden administration has promised to place at a more central position in U.S. policy?
Well, it's a great question, Jacques, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, but I'll toss out a few to get the thing started. I think at the most basic level, the impact of all of these actions that you described is they're going to place a pretty hard ceiling on how far the relationship can develop, because the American people are not going to turn away from what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in Xinjiang, the social controls, the pressure on Taiwan. And every message that we have received from Beijing suggests that Beijing is not going to bend or adjust its approach on any of these issues under the assault of external pressure, because they feel like they are China's internal issues and everyone else can bugger off. So we are just in a fundamental disagreement on many of these issues, and they're going to be with us for a while, I suspect. But there's another element, I think, that also is putting a ceiling on the relationship, probably a pretty low ceiling, and that is domestic politics in both countries. I think that the national narratives in both countries are that the other side is to blame for the downturn in relations. And because of that, Americans don't feel like the United States has culpability for working to improve the relationship, and China is mirroring that same viewpoint. And so there is, I think, a pretty high political cost for leaders in both countries to take steps that are perceived to be accommodative or solicitous of an improvement in relationship, and to be seen as weak in chasing after the other. And so when you add those two features together, I think it's reasonable to reach a conclusion that that this relationship is going to be pretty bumpy for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I'd agree completely with that. And I think what you have is partly domestic politics and partly, I think, constrained by domestic politics, but on its own footing, just some very different definitions about what the international environment should be like. And it's always hard to tease out disingenuity from sincerity, but I think it is fair to say that we know China is more capable than it used to be. So the US ability to exercise leverage is less. We can't coerce, that's too risky, and the gap, although still significant, in terms of hard power has closed some, especially in the scenarios that operate very near China. And when you look at the sort of ideational side of it, China is much more self-confident, much more assertive in saying, we don't really have to socialize into the other values out there, with different conception of what human rights looks like, different conception of the robustness of sovereignty, different views on whether, certain liberal democratic values are things that they should have to take. It's like, no, we do it our way, you do it your way. And maybe our way is not just our way, but a way that the rest of the world might want to consider imitating. That is not something you would have seen a generation ago. It smacks of Cold War ideational conflict. The difference, of course, is that we're deeply interdependent and nobody's trying to do formal empire of a territorial sort anymore. And so that probably helps some. But I take all of that, and I think one of the issues here is how much China can succeed in trying to define the boundaries of who's being the revisionist here, right? And so if it really is internal affairs we're mucking around, that's a much more powerful argument than these are universal values. And by the way, we're talking about they're operating in areas which aren't fully under your discretion, either because human rights run everywhere or because, Xinjiang has an ethnically and religiously distinct group, Taiwan is separately governed, and so on. And I think the real challenge here, as you point to, is it does put a hard ceiling, I think, on the relationship, especially given the Biden administration's commitment to values and allies. But it puts the real challenge in terms of how much can you compartmentalize? Can you cooperate on climate and other things without it being scuttled by the real frictions in other areas? And on a more benign scenario, can you build from cooperation in some areas to take at least some of the hard edge, if not the conflict of values and interests, off these other issue areas?
Yeah, it's very well said.
So let me move on to another dimension of the relationship, which has come up in some of the questions, which is the economic relationship, which has, for many years was the ballast. It was the thing that was going right, even as we disagreed about politics. And then the issues started layering on, right? Market access, intellectual property protection, commercial espionage, and industrial policy, goosing the rise of high-tech industries in China, a long list of concerns. So what do you see going forward? Does the Biden administration continue to press familiar issues here? Is there hope for progress on that, given that we had a lot of heat, but not much light, perhaps, on these kinds of issues in the last administration? And to sort of take the economic parallel to some of the things you were talking about earlier, do you see the U.S., say, re-engaging CPTPP? Do you see a greater openness to reinvigorating the WTO? Is that part of the strategy? So kind of a big question there, but the economic relationship got its problems. What can the Biden administration do about it, and how much of it is bilateral and how much of it might be more multilateral?
Well, it's a great question. It's a monster question. I will try to take a few nibbles at it, but welcome your follow-up. I think as a starting point, the Biden administration is going to be focused on what they talk about often, of connecting foreign policy to the middle class. In other words, there's going to be much more focus on how the policies they pursue relate to job creation and other bread and butter issues inside the United States, and less so on some of these more esoteric issues or on generating market access for BlackRock and Goldman Sachs. And so I think that the bilateral investment treaty, just as an example, probably will be a lower priority in the Biden administration than it was during the Obama administration. Also, as sort of a starting point, my sense is that there is a view that the Trump administration tried very hard to exert unilateral pressure to compel China to bend to our will, and it didn't work. It came at a high cost to the United States without offsetting benefit. $30 billion of your and my taxpayer dollars are being used to subsidize American farmers who have lost China as a reliable export market as a consequence. The evidence of the results of the trade war is pretty clear, and it's overwhelmingly on the side of it not delivering the results that it sought. And so I don't expect that there will be an effort or desire to sort of repeat that experiment again. Rather, I think the focus will shift toward finding our friends who share common concerns with us, and then figuring out where we have common concerns, where we can work together. And I think that we will probably see a resumption of what used to happen in the past, where the United States will put pressure on China first, and then Japan or Europe will follow us, and then we will follow them, and just sort of keep on pushing away at trying to nudge the Chinese in our preferred directions on some of these issues, such as overcapacity, industrial policy, SOE issues, and intellectual property and the like.
And so so one of the things that has changed for the last several years is the US is not the proponent of liberalizing trade agreements that it once was, right? And the TPP obviously was something was going on back when you were in government, and Obama was in many ways the principal actor pushing that, but it was already in trouble before 2016. You know, the president was granted trade promotion authority, but it looked like the TPP was going to be in trouble in Congress. Although I think Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump would have been very different presidents on the TPP. Hillary was also not out there swinging for it. It was partly domestic politics. And Biden has talked about really a smidgen of economic nationalism, right? Build back better, the need to source a lot of things domestically. So where do you see that one going? How much movement do you see back toward international trade liberalism? And I should put in a plug here for another one of our members of the Future of U.S. China Relations Project, which is Mark Wu, who's going to be working with USTR on this.
That's right. That's right. He's going to be on the inside. I guess the way that I think about it, Jacques, is that there is going to be an emphasis in the Biden administration on environmental and labor protection being built into any negotiations that take place as it relates to trade agreements. And I also think that there are ways to advance the ball being invested in CPTPP wholly or not at all. In other words, we can break this into bites and push it forward piece by piece if it isn't palatable for us to move wholesale in the direction of CPTPP. But my expectation is that the more interaction that President Biden has with his counterparts in Asia, the stronger the demand signal that he will receive from our Japanese friends and our Singaporean friends and our Australian friends and others. And that's not going to override his domestic political considerations, but it will certainly inform, I think, the way that he thinks about CPTPP. And if we're not going to rejoin CPTPP, we need to think about something else that helps sort of find cohesion between us and our Asian trading partners, because it's going to be the most dynamic region of the world for our lifetimes. And we're either going to be integrated and involved in that economy, or we're going to be standing on the sidelines as RCEP and CPTPP move forward without us.
So serves me right for uttering the phrase Cold War earlier in our discussion, but there's a couple of questions in the chat about the anonymous longer telegram, obviously an homage to George Kennan and the long telegram that was essentially the intellectual foundation for containment toward the Soviet Union. What do you make of that in terms of where it fits in the landscape of U.S. policy toward China and where the Biden administration line up on it? And of course, a questioner wants to know, who do you think wrote the longer telegram?
Well, I was hoping you were going to tell me.
I thought it was you, Ryan. No.
No. Well, I was talking with a friend this morning in Beijing who shared with me that there is a high degree of focus in China on this longer telegram, who the author was, what the signal was, why was it released right now. And to be honest, I mean, I was a little bit disappointed by that, because whoever it was, I don't think is a part of the Biden administration. And my hope is that our friends in Beijing will spend a lot more time focusing on what President Biden and his team are saying than what an anonymous former official is speculating in a 70-page treatise that a very small subsection of our community will read in full. But on the substance of the document itself, I guess I wish that returning the clock to pre-2013 was an available option. It isn't. I don't think that there is a policy option that allows us to just magically turn the clock back to before Xi Jinping. Second, I don't see a lot of evidence to support the view embedded in that piece that there is the possibility of factionalism within the top echelon of the Chinese Communist Party, where one side can be played off against the other. And third, I'm not sure that all of the problems that we're encountering are attributable to Xi Jinping. He has certainly brought a personality and a face to a lot of these trends that we've been talking about, but he's not the originator of them, nor is he the author of China's ambitions. I think that there's been pretty broadly continuous Chinese ambitions for some time, and that they precede Xi and will outlive him as well. So I guess that's a long way of saying it's an interesting exercise, a brilliant marketing move, but maybe not the most compelling argument.
Yeah, the last time a China hand was rumored to be anonymous, I think it was John Huntsman in the op-ed about the grown-ups in the room containing the Trump administration. I'll take him out of that. Yeah, so I want to sort of broaden from that a little bit, which is you made the point about how everybody in Beijing is trying to suss out, or at least many, the policy relevance are trying to figure out how to suss out the longer telegram. And as you know, it's a common sport, trying to suss out the meaning of everybody from Anthony Blinken to Kurt Campbell to, you know, people who are the junior crowd on the NSC and beyond that. What does it all mean? And of course, there was a lot of discussion in China about who it's in China's interest to have win the election, a Trump second term versus a Biden term and all that. And there was something of a range of views there, but to the extent you can pick out, you know, a mainstream view or main schools of thought on this, what do you think the relevant Chinese expect from U.S. policy toward the relationship under Biden?
Well, first of all, I think that the Chinese have been a bit overwhelmed by the first couple of weeks, just sort of the strength of the Biden administration's message, as well as the coolness of the Biden administration toward direct engagement with the Chinese. So I think that diverged from their expectations about how the Biden administration would approach the relationship. But taking a step back, my sense is that Beijing is rather pessimistic about prospects for improvement in U.S. China relations. And I think it's for two primary reasons. The first is that Beijing, their analysis, the mainstream analysis in Beijing is that as the gap in relative power between the United States and China narrowed, that the United States would become more anxious, defensive, and aggressive in seeking to suppress China's rise. And in Donald Trump's behavior, they sort of saw validation of their assumptions. This is something I heard as far back as 2008 when I was a reporting officer in the embassy in Beijing and would talk to a lot of people across the country. And so they feel like they're validated. And from that viewpoint, China believes that time is on its side, that they're continuing to grow relatively to the United States. Their economy is the only economy this year, major economy that has grown. They've managed COVID, they think, relatively well. And they feel like, they have some wind at their back. And because of that, they expect that the United States will be sort of reactively defensive in seeking to suppress China, which will place a limit on improvement in relationship. But the other, I think, thread of analysis that informs their pessimism is their view that Joe Biden just has a ton of issues on his plate, and he's not going to want to, carry political water inside the United States political system to support a major improvement in the overall relationship.
Yeah, I think that all absolutely right on. There is a sort of internal debate in China about which is better, right? So there was the pro-Trump view that said he's going to drive the U.S. off a cliff. It's going to be a Thelma and Louise moment, so we should want that. And then there's another view that says, wait a second, just as there's long been an argument in the U.S. that chaos inside China is not good for the U.S., well, chaos inside the U.S. may not be good for China. On the other hand, it's very hard not to take some Schadenfreude glee, and the sort of official Chinese media has been playing up the January 6th events and things like that. But my sense, and I wonder if you share this, is that for a lot of people who are in the kind of day-to-day foreign policy business in China, there is an understanding that things aren't going to get better. It's not going to be sunshine and puppies. The view that this would return to how good the relationship was 10 years ago. Nobody thinks the Biden administration is going there. On the other hand, isn't there just some sense of relief of you don't have to live like we were living, and what's the latest tweet, what's going to happen tomorrow? That it's going to be a tough relationship. There's going to be friction. There's not a lot of buy-in from the U.S. to try to restore things immediately, but at least you're not going to have the headache causing, gee, what happened today?
No, I completely agree with that. I think that's exactly right. when you and I both spend a lot of time talking with our Chinese friends over Zoom late at nights and early in the mornings, and basically what I've picked up over the past couple of weeks is just a sense of relief that there is a return of a certain degree of professionalism, where we will disagree with each other, but we'll do so in, within the bounds of normal diplomatic discourse, where we're not going to surprise each other, and we'll just deal forthrightly with problems as they come about. And I think that will provide a little bit of grounding and ballast to the relationship going forward.
My lights keep going off here. It's this ridiculous timed lighting system. I have to hire a research assistant to stand back there and do calisthenics. So we have one big issue which we've touched upon, but we've got a bunch of questions about, and I know it's of interest to much of our audience, which is the question of Taiwan. And you and I have talked about this some, including partly in the Brookings CSIS report that talks about a stronger U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So, what do you see going on there, right? We've seen in the last 4 years a bunch of things that, although it's been a somewhat bumpy road, that congratulatory phone call from Tsai Ing-wen to then President-elect Trump, complicated issue. But by and large, we've seen a warming of U.S.-Taiwan relations, stronger U.S. support for Taiwan. We've seen it in an alphabet soup of congressional enactments, the Taipei Act being the most cutely titled of them, but a bunch of things would say, let's do more to support Taiwan in international organizations. Let's try to push back against the loss of diplomatic allies. Let's beef up defense cooperation in some degrees, allow higher level contacts. Indeed, one of the last things the Trump administration did on the way out the door was to say we can have still higher level contacts. And we almost sent the UN ambassador over there, but that was ultimately uphold. And the Biden administration has said and Biden's as a candidate and as president-elect has said quite positive things about the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. So where do you see that going, and what do you see as the drivers of Biden policy on that issue?
Well, it's a great question, and I will try to trigger your response here because I'm curious to hear your reaction to this. But I think that the big gap in recent years in this overall warming of U.S.-Taiwan relations that you've described was on trade and economic issues. That was just a null set in an otherwise vibrant environment. And my guess is that the Biden administration recognizes that and recognizes that the long-term health and viability of Taiwan depends largely upon how vibrant, successful, and stable they are economically. And so there's a lot of work to be done there. And if a free trade agreement is too heavy of a lift, then again, this can be broken into pieces, chapter by chapter. Let's work through it. And at the end of the day, see if we come out with what amounts to, essentially a free trade agreement. But I think the overall objectives of U.S. policy toward Taiwan will remain pretty consistent. They have been pretty consistent for a long time, and that's to help Taiwan feel secure against external threat, able to pursue its economic interests as it defines them, and feeling dignity and respect on the world stage. And I think those are the objectives that will continue to guide the Biden administration's approach to Taiwan in the coming period. Some of this will depend upon China's approach to Taiwan. The more sporty Beijing is towards Taiwan, the more pressure there is on the United States to more visibly support Taiwan as a counterbalance. But overall, my sense with Tsai Ing-wen is that she is steady, dependable, and wants to be predictable. I think in Joe Biden, she has found someone who values those same traits as it relates to cross-strait issues.
I think that all is right on. I think that it's fair to say that U.S.-Taiwan relations, for all their ups and downs, one of the constancies has been that the U.S. kind of looks at trouble in cross-strait relations, figures out who is responsible, and kind of leans to the other side, right? So when Chen Shui-bian back in the day was out there doing provocative things, the U.S., Tom Christensen, Deputy Assistant Secretary at the time, famously did this, saying, no, don't do that. But the Tsai Ing-wen era, and it's partly Tsai, who despite being from the DPP, the supposedly more anti-China, if you will, made it very clear that she was out to keep stability, not to be provocative. And Beijing basically snubbed her. and has escalated. So yeah, I think a lot of this is the U.S. assessment of who's at fault, and that now clearly is, in the U.S. view, Beijing, not Taipei. And also, I think, as you alluded to, it's the broader trajectory in the U.S. China relationship. There was a time when you could think that Taiwan was the most likely cause of an unnecessary U.S. China conflict, and the Chen years were probably the high point of that. But now I think there's a sense that the conflict is kind of baked in, and you wouldn't do much to improve U.S. China relations by acceding to Beijing's preferences on Taiwan, and that we have the sort of various value stakes and strategic stakes. So it starts a little more like an asset again. But normatively, we're just not going there. And I think you're absolutely right on the trade issue. In fact, we had B.K. Chow, the representative of Taiwan, the sort of ambassador equivalent. If we had formal relations, she'd be the ambassador, on last week. And a big theme was this attempt to move forward on the economic leg. The bilateral trade agreement, as you know, she made unilateral concessions on ractopamine, that nasty additive that has been the source of Taiwanese restrictions on U.S. beef and pork exports, which are not big in dollars, but are big in domestic politics. So let me ask you the tough question on that one. Is strategic ambiguity still the right policy for the U.S. on cross-strait relations?
Well, straight into the deep end of the pool, huh? Yeah, no, I learned much more about ractopamine over the past decade than I ever thought I would in my lifetime. On your question about strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity, it's a tough one. I guess my starting point is the Taiwan Relations Act, which sort of legislates our posture on these issues. And basically what we're asking is, should U.S. policy deviate from U.S. law as it relates to Taiwan? I don't think so. I think that the Taiwan Relations Act is a pretty clear statement of American views, priorities, and interests. And I also think that we should keep in mind, what the second and third order effects would be of a policy of strategic clarity. We may seek to solve one problem and create others. Tsai Ing-wen has fended off, I think, pretty valiantly pressure from her deep green base, far left, I think in their terms, to stake out a pretty moderate and consistent course as it relates to Taiwan identity and cross-strait issues. If we were to move the goalpost, we would blow out her legs from under her. I think we also need to keep in mind 2024 is not that far off, and what impact a policy shift would have on domestic politics inside Taiwan, and how would that reverberate throughout the 2024 election? Would it lead to outcomes that may not be in America's long-term interest? So I guess that's a long way of saying that I'm not at the moment persuaded that we need to make that shift. And I think that there are real downside risks that should be measured before any such decision is made.
We're coming up on the end of our time here, but there are two other questions in the chat box about other powers in the region that I want to give you a quick chance to answer, and then let you close with any advice you give the Biden administration on how to handle China going forward, to the extent we haven't already done that in our conversation. The two countries that people ask about are the other major power in the region, India, in the Indo-Pacific. And basically, U.S. policy now talks about an Indo-Pacific rather than just an Asia-Pacific or a Pacific strategy. What role do you see India playing in the U.S.-China relationship, especially since India-China relations are not exactly the best state they've ever been right now? And the other country of consequence is North Korea, where the Biden administration, of course, is reviewing its North Korea strategy before it takes on the nuclear issue. Is this an area where you think China an area of potential cooperation with China? Again, it's been a checkered story in the past, but so two easy questions there in a minute or two each: India and North Korea.
Well, thanks for the softballs. On North Korea, I think that we should probably have modest expectations about how much work China will be willing to do on our behalf. China's interests and America's interests overlap to a limited degree on North Korea. Neither one of us sees benefit from North Korea breaking out into a full-on nuclear state, or at least being recognized as such. And so we have an interest there, but once you move beyond that, I think that the overlap in our perspectives begins to fray a fair bit. And so any approach that we make towards North Korea needs to be mindful of those limits. On India, I think that India and the United States do have broadly converging interest in the region. I think that there is, substance behind the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific as a organizing principle. But we should approach this with modesty and patience. I think that perhaps Washington perpetually runs the risk of creating high hopes for India moving into strategic alignment with the United States against China that never are realized and never will be realized. India has its own complex and long history with China. And there will be opportunities where the United States and India will be able to work together. But my humble advice would be to sort of break that down on an issue by issue basis, and pragmatically and opportunistically look for areas to work together, rather than pursuing some type of grand alignment in opposition to China, which is not, I think, an idea that has purchase in New Delhi.
So implicitly and it points explicitly in our discussion over the last nearly hour has been advice to the Biden administration about what U.S. policy toward China and related issues should be. So if you've got any other advice that you haven't gotten to yet that you'd like to get out, since I'm sure they're watching us with bated breath. Otherwise, I will move on. Thank you. So any last words of advice? Yeah,
well, I guess the only thought that I would offer, I'm not sure if it qualifies as advice, and I'm pretty sure they don't need my advice, but the hard reality is that the United States is not going to change China any more than China is going to change the United States. We're locked into a long-term systems competition with each other, where each side will seek to show the world that its governance and social model is more effective than the other side's. And I think prestige will be derived from performance. So whichever system performs better at unlocking the potential of its people will enjoy the pull of power in the international system. And that would be, I guess, the starting point of how I would be thinking about our competition with China if I had an opportunity to share those thoughts with folks in the administration.
Well, I'm sure you will, and I'm sure you do, actually, the people you know. So I just want to take, now we're up against our time here, to take the opportunity to thank Ryan for just a terrific session. That was amazingly nuanced and wide-ranging, and you can see why we were delighted to have him here, have him as one of the contributors to our project on the future of U.S.-China relations. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ryan. I hope those of you who are interested in these issues and want to talk about things we may not have gotten to today, we talked not so much about Japan, but we'll get to that in tomorrow's session with Michael Auslin, so please join us for that. So I will close by thanking Ryan again, and by throwing it back to Raleigh, and by thanking all of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jacques, and thank you, Ryan. That was a terrific discussion and a great example of why FPRI matters and how we bring you a much richer and deeper discussion than most of the other outlets where you can learn about China. So thank you for that. Thank you to our audience and our supporters and our donors. And also we had several questions about whether there would be a video of this, and yes, there will. We're recording it. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, and we'll also be sending it out to everyone who attended and I think even registered today. So thank you again. Take care and stay safe. We'll see you tomorrow, I hope.